rolling.
We are rolling. What's up, wife?
Just kind of riding the wave of chaos.
Indeed. So we're in the throes of packing, getting ready to move.
We had a nice visit from your friend Steve yesterday.
Good friend of mine, Steve, who 20-year military veteran flying a B-1 bomber, and I got to hang out with him, and we related many stories that we both...
I'd only met him him and his wife once before when Rob and I first met, and let's just say in the few hours that we spent together yesterday, I learned a lot about what you did as a teenager.
Yeah, and most of it was probably incarceration worthy, so...
There were lots of laughs.
We turned out okay.
You guys survived.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Yep. We did.
What are you drinking?
I'm drinking a Salty Palmer, which is a black tea, Lipton iced tea specifically, with a element citrus salt in it. And it's pretty darn good.
Really good.
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to jump in on this thing?
Sure, let's jump in. Our first question this week is from Cassandra, and Cassandra wrote a very, very lengthy question. And I'm
Great
just going to
detail,
read
but it's
really
pretty
wonderful
long.
detail, but I'm just going to read some sections of it. But the main gist of her question is, how do you recommend tackling post-workout nutrition for endurance and high-intensity sports while on keto? So let's see here. Okay, so she says... I think I'm generally fat adapted, but I panic after 8 or 9 miles sometimes because the old advice of carb loading always creeps back in. And I will suck down a terrible gel or Gatorade because I've made the mistake of running these distances underfueled before, and it was a painful lesson. I've heeded your electrolyte advice, and I constantly track my sodium, magnesium, and potassium levels and take the recommended supplements almost every day, normally on days with a taxing WOD or a workout lasting more than 90 minutes. So what can I eat or drink to keep on the keto train that will help me recover and keep me going on some of these endurance events? Nut butters, whey protein, and water. I want to be armed when I take on Vegas this year and not completely derail my eating habits, and I'd like to start experimenting with these foods now while I still have time to adjust. Sorry for writing the novel. So just to fill in some of the details, she has done several half marathons and a marathon, and she's wanting to do another full marathon later this year, the Rock and Roll in Las Vegas.
And lots of great details. So if you guys check out the show notes, you can kind of dig into that stuff. So one thing up front, I'm definitely not an endurance coach. Like, we've dabbled in that area when we ran the gym. It wasn't really my area of interest nor expertise. So I'm going to give some general guidelines, but I'm not an endurance coach. That said, one thing that I would recommend is following all the work from Zach Bitter. He has set multiple, national and world champion distances, 100-mile races, wow. Largely keto fueled, keto carnivore fueled. He drops in some carbs out, and he has kind of a strategy around what he does with that. Part of what she related is she feels soreness and difficulty recovering after her hard sessions, in particular when she's using carbs, interestingly. And this is one of the interesting things that folks that are in that keto carnivore space seem to report. They just seem to bounce back from workouts better. Like, they don't seem to get the delayed onset muscle soreness and all that stuff. And it's kind of funny, before we were recording this, I was kind of noodling in the shower about how low carb in the context of a higher protein, like ketogene style ketogenic diet or carnivore diet, or even some of the old, original Lauren Cordain protein recommendations, even though it's low carb technically because you're not eating carbohydrate as part of the diet, it's not necessarily low glycogen. The keto scene has gotten all freaked out about gluconeogenesis and being kicked out of ketosis, but this is all still like super context-driven stuff. For an individual that needs really legit levels of ketones for, say, like neurological condition or for cancer co-treatment or something like that, then there's a compelling reason to kind of limit protein. But what's interesting is that, and again, I'm going to bounce around like there's a zillion things I'm thinking about, but Charles Poliquin recommended for people who were not particularly carb sensitive but doing high intensity training a pretty high protein, low carb diet, and then supplemental glutamine post workout, because the glutamine was kind of a slow release way of topping off glycogen levels, both in the liver and the muscles, but that didn't have some of the other side effects potentially of carbs. And I know people are going to freak out. It's like, oh, carbs aren't the devil. Yeah, they're not, except when they are. And like for some people like me who still have some sort of GI problems or what have you, type 1 diabetics, or people that are just tinkering with this stuff, like there are other ways of getting reasonably good glycogen repletion while also still staying in more of that kind of fat adapted world. So one thing about this, and we have to break this stuff into, kind of training nutrition, event nutrition, post-recovery nutrition. And so during the event, this is definitely where she made the point that she needs to experiment with this stuff and see what's working. And again, I would kind of punt to what Zach Bitter does as just kind of a beginning baseline. I think that in general, if he's doing something that's more in that 100-mile pace, he stays pretty much fat and protein. Because he's going to be going at such a gentle pace comparatively, because he's going to run for basically like 2 days straight. And so he's just not going to get glycolytic. So in that context, then there doesn't necessarily need to be additional carbs or not much additional carbs to the degree that there might be a lot of elevation change or something like that. And therefore going anaerobic, getting some glycolysis going on. Then we might drop in some type of carb. And again, you just have to play around with that stuff to see what sits well, with gastric emptying and all that type of stuff. I feel like I'm just kind of bouncing around here, but it's interesting. So she also mentions that, that in the past, she was kind of worried at some point. And this is where I think doing some training runs that are on the longer side and to establish, like, how do you do? So she said that she panics after 8 or 9 miles sometimes. So there should probably be some like 12 or 15 mile runs consistently within the training block where you pressure test this. Like, how do you feel at mile 10 through 15 with a particular type of training without necessarily doing a GU or something like that? And even that said, there are a lot of people in the low carb space that over the course of a day of activity like this, they may consume 200 or 300 grams of carbs on that day, which is still quite a bit less than what most other people are doing. But this is where there's just a massive amount of individual variation. And again, I'm just not the most knowledgeable person on that side of things. But so the takeaways, we don't necessarily need to just cater towards ketosis. Don't think about it being ketosis. Think about it being performance fueling. It may be on the lower carb side. It may be on the higher carb side. Even if it's on the lower carb side, if our protein intake is higher, it doesn't necessarily mean low glycogen for the body. And so that can have all kinds of ramifications for recovery and nutrient intake. So
she definitely needs to make sure she's not skimping on the protein.
Absolutely, yeah. The one caveat with that, and this is where it gets really detailed, in event training, you may be, particularly if water's maybe a little bit limited or what have you, higher protein intake requires more water to deal with the ammonia load that's coming out of that. But you don't necessarily want to go super low protein, because you will burn through all your branched chain amino acids and then tryptophan levels raise. The person will be running along and they get sleepy and they'll literally like fall asleep. And it happens a lot on a bicycle mid-run, and or at a minimum you lose some of that kind of motivation because you're getting sleepy. So this is some of the stuff, again, that folks just have to play with. Like, what protein level keeps you mentally alert because you have enough branched chain amino acids in the mix. Some people use some branched chain amino acids as part of their, training mix and stuff like that. But this is, again, where it's just super outside my wheelhouse. But those are some kind of big, broad brush strokes that to consider when you're doing this stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. Our next question is from Ben. Should I add fat to my whey protein shake? Ben says, hi, I love the podcast. I'm one of the 6 listeners. Here is my question. I'm wondering if the insulin spike from a post-workout whey shake can stall my weight loss. Should I add fat like heavy cream or coconut milk to the shake to blunt the insulin response? And if yes, how much? Or am I unable to burn that fat because of the spiked insulin, storing it as body fat instead? Thank you so much, and best wishes from Munich, Germany.
Man, so whenever I see someone who's so clearly I would read between the lines here that the goal is fat loss, right? If you're in a fat loss mode, you don't need a shake. You just don't. You need to chew food. 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, possibly a snack. I rarely have a snack. I eat 2, sometimes 3 meals a day. It just kind of depends, but you don't need a snack, and you really don't need the shake as a baseline. That's not really answering the question, but we noticed this within our gym-based practice, and I kind of felt like, and I would have all kinds of people like Spencer Nadolski that, like, oh, shakes aren't the devil and everything, but I just saw people spin out, and they would go from eating pretty well and then do liquid food, and then they were hungry, and then they would end up overeating pretty consistently. Then I started hanging out with Tyler and Luis and really watched the way that they handled things within the Keto Gains group. And man, they could have made a mint, like linking wagons with some protein company and recommending that. And just their ethics are so sound that what they noticed was that people who are really legitimately struggling with weight loss don't do well with liquid food, don't do well with shakes. They need to eat whole, unprocessed food for the most part. So, Ben, I would, it kind of becomes a non-issue. Like if we get people eating whole, unprocessed food, it's not really going to be a problem. That said, in the context of like eating beef or whey protein and the subsequent insulin response from that, it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things whether or not that's going to influence fat loss overall. That's still going to be driven by total caloric load, ultimately. And some of the things mixed into that, if we get, like in some people, and this is where some people tolerate more or fewer carbs, if we get a disproportionate insulin response to carbohydrates and we get a low blood sugar environment, then people are going to tend to want to eat more food. We tend to not see this when the insulin response is from protein. And this is another piece that's kind of interesting when people talk about like bodybuilding or recovery. Proteins do release insulin. And so you're not necessarily always in a completely low insulin environment, even though you're eating low carb. This gets borne out when you see the flip side of the crazy keto scene where people are limiting protein intake because they're freaked out about the insulin response to this whole thing. So I know that's kind of all over the place, but Ben, I would definitely ditch the shake. And once you get to a level of leanness that is fantastic, and you're training like absolute crazy such that 3 meals a day don't work, then dump a shake in. But I wish that shakes did as well as real food, but they just don't. And, it's another one of these things where we've really never recommended shakes here and there, specific situations. But yeah, so I think I beat that one to death.
Okay. Let's see. Our next question is from James on portal circulation and leaky gut. Hi, Rob. Thanks for your detailed answer to my question about sun exposure in Q&A number 7. Following your book recommendations in Q&A number 6, I hungrily delved into the lecture notes on human metabolism. Thanks, Nicki. And within the first chapter encountered some information that gave me reason to pause. The portal circulation. I'm certain that you can provide a more accurate and concise explanation of this system to your listeners than I can in this question, so I'll leave that to you if that's okay. My question is, given that all blood, and therefore solutes, from the intestines are drained through the portal vein and through the liver, filtering out excess substrates and removing toxins such as ammonia from the blood before it enters general circulation, how can leaky gut have such a damaging effect on the body? It seems to me that the liver is a vital backstop in this process, which is never mentioned when functional medicine practitioners talk about leaky gut. They give the impression that blood drains from the intestines straight into cardiovascular circulation, and these fuel substrates are clanking around in our arteries, causing inflammation, which seems not to be the case. Also, how does this impact the gut hypothesis of heart disease, highly simplified here, where endotoxins is said to pass through the mucosal membrane into circulation, binding with LDL cholesterol, being attacked and immobilized by immune cells and ultimately ending up being sequestered into an arterial plaque because the immune system cannot destroy cholesterol or unbind the endotoxin from it. Would the portal circulation not remove this endotoxin from the blood before it enters cardiovascular circulation and meets LDL particles? Is this disease process driven not only by a compromised intestinal lining, but also by inefficient liver function? Thank you for your time. Really appreciate your input.
That's a great question, and this is kind of like definitely like a 401 question. Like this is kind of
super advanced.
Chris Masterjohn area. Usually he's the one that delves into stuff like this, but it's a fantastic question. So for people that aren't familiar with this, the portal circulation is the kind of circulatory loop that drains the gut and goes, as James said, largely to the liver. And we do get, this is where like chylomicrons, the packages of lipids are unstitched and reshuffled and put into triglycerides and into lipoproteins. Proteins are kind of sorted and shuffled. Carbohydrates are stored at least in part in the liver and then also throughout the rest of the body. And that's actually a great example of this LPS story that James is alluding to. So what he's asking here is a great question. In this leaky gut story, there's this discussion around lipopolysaccharide, which is kind of the cellular identification matrix around bacteria. And this stuff is incredibly inflammatory in all vertebrates. Like it sends the vertebrate immune system into a kind of an overdrive response. But James, if we just subbed out LPS for carbohydrate, this pretty much answers the story. So although dietary carbohydrate fills some, potentially all of the liver glycogen, there's virtually always more that goes to the rest of the body. And so although it removes some, it does not remove all. In the case of this LPS story, in general, the liver should be effective. The liver, in conjunction with the lipoproteins like LDL lipoprotein, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, these things bond to LPS and it tends to help in the detoxification of this substance. But if we have more LPS than what we're really able to deal with, then liver handles some, and then we get the spillover. And that's one piece of the story. Another piece of the story is that a lot of the lipid-containing substances don't go directly into the portal system. It goes into the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system then dumps in right around the aorta, and so it does make it into general circulation without going through the liver first. So that 1 year of medical school anatomy actually pays off every once in a while. So this is a great question, though, and so there are kind of two directions that the LPS story gets around the liver. The first one is that there may just be more occurring than what the liver can reasonably detoxify. And then the other part is the lipid constituents that end up in the lymphatic system also end up dumped into general circulation, do ultimately make it into the liver, but that's another spot where this stuff ends up. Yeah, but a really good question. And man, that lecture notes on human metabolism is just an outstanding book. Really, really good. It was oriented for individuals heading towards medical school, so it was kind of an end of their senior year, like how to pull all the biochemistry, cellular biology, vertebrate physiology all together and make some sense of it. And the MD PhD who put that book together, he oriented a bunch of like pharmaceuticals into it. He talked about statins. He talked about blood pressure meds. Like it's really an outstanding book. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Our next question is on phytic acid from Joseph. Is phytic acid harmful or of benefit? Is it really necessary to jump through the hoops of soaking and sprouting before consuming nuts and seeds?
What do you think on this, wife? What's your gut sense?
A lot of people do find benefit when they soak and sprout.
For sure, and I would throw this under the "it depends" category. Right. And so phytates and even, there's this stuff out of rice, I want to say, IP6, which is kind of one of these bonding chemicals, kind of chelation type chemicals, they can be beneficial in some circumstances and they can be a bastard in other circumstances. Georgia Ede, who is a psychiatrist and really incredibly knowledgeable on this stuff, has some great studies where individuals would eat something like oysters, which are very high in zinc, and it would you would quantify the amount of zinc in the oysters. Then the person would consume it, and they would actually do like some plasma zinc analysis, so they can show, okay, the before oyster plasma zinc was here, and post oyster plasma. So it's showing that you're absorbing it, or it's magically appearing in your bloodstream, one or the other. Then she showed eating the same oyster meal, but with either, say, like fruit or corn tortillas. The fruit does not have phytates in it. The corn tortillas have quite a lot. And the corn tortillas plus the zinc source basically made the zinc absorption 0. I mean, it just gutted it. So this is one of these things that's really interesting. And in looking at a lot of the Weston A. Price stuff, traditional cultures bent over backwards to soak and sprout and ferment and process grains, legumes, and even dairy for the most part. And so I think that there was some really good wisdom to all that, and it kind of dovetails around on another piece around this kind of emerging story around like the carnivore concept and whatnot. And I could make a case that how do I want to say this? The amount of plant material that we eat is allowable only up to the point that it displaces animal products. At some point, the overconsumption of plant material could potentially cause nutrient depletion. And I know this is going to be like a super controversial topic, but when you look at, say, just things like spinach, they may contain different nutrients that may be valuable, and they may look like they're in a large amount, particularly from a nutrient density standpoint, like a percentage of like folate per calorie. But the thing is, the plant-based materials are not that absorbable, and oftentimes have constituents in them like phytates that are antagonistic towards their absorption. These things can also interfere with, they're basically protease inhibitors, so they inhibit the ability to break down protein, both plant and animal protein. So, again, like, how important is it? I think it boils down a little bit to individual situations, but I think to the degree that people can get away with not doing this is reflective of all the other right stuff they're doing. And also, I think that it's you're just kind of like beating your system a little bit. Like there's some pressure testing that's occurring there. So like if you're going to do bread, I would do something like an Ezekiel bread that's been soaked and sprouted and all that type of stuff. A lot of people are finding these ancient grains like the einhorn wheat and then soaking, sprouting, doing the sourdough mix that helps to break down the gluten and all that stuff. Although there's some great literature indicating that not a lot of celiacs still react to like the einhorn wheat even after it's gone through all of that stuff. And I'll be completely honest, even though the Weston A. Price stuff is pretty cool, I think that this is still why a lot of people are pretty fucked up in that scene, because they're just religiously dogmatic about having these foods, and they don't realize that even some pastured dairy may be problematic for some people. Yeah. So it's super context driven, and this is again where if somebody has general problems or they're just wanting to ask a question, if they may be grain, dairy, or legume reactive, like pull them out for 30 days, reintroduce, and see how you do. But I would say that to the degree that you process these things with these traditional methods, it's definitely going to improve the nutrient value of those foods, and it's going to decrease the likelihood of damaging the nutrient value of other foods.
Okay. Let's see, our final question this week is from Rory. He wants to know about a caloric estimate for young children. Rory says, is there an estimate for calories per pound when it comes to feeding my almost 3-year-old, or any child that for that matter, say from 2 to 12? The teen years, of course, marking the onset of self-consciousness and peer pressure, thus thwarting any biological hardwiring towards survival. Or is she still young enough to be biologically incapable of starving herself, at which point I should just trust that she has normally functioning satiety signals? I ask specifically about my daughter because, as is par for the course in America, she received antibiotics immediately after being born, so it's not a stretch for me to imagine that she could have some kind of gut imbalance that could cause hormone dysregulation with her leptin and ghrelin.
Good question, but my gut sense is Rory's probably being a little too worried about this. And it also, like, I don't know how early, how old did she say?
Almost
She's
3.
3? Okay. Yeah. I mean, I know there are some benchmarks out there. I think it's something like 16 or 18 calories per pound, or maybe it's 20 calories per pound. I forget off the top of my head, but it's a lot of calories generally. But even if you know this, then it's like you're going to weigh and measure their food, and then you need to weigh and measure what they didn't eat, and you need to separate out the protein, carbs, fat.
It's like a lot of work.
It's a lot of fucking work. Like, I just, the risk-reward deal, I just don't see. Yeah.
I think you feed them, and they eat until they're
full,
especially if you're feeding them unprocessed, real foods. They're not gonna overeat.
Right. And they will generally not undereat, and also kids tend to cycle.
They do cycle.
Zoe and Sagan, it's funny. So we don't have a pool, but our friend has a pool, and we've been taking them swimming. And on the days when they swim, they don't really eat that much. And you're like, man, they should be really hungry. But then I tell you what, the next day they eat everything that's not nailed down, and they just don't want to get out of the water. So they might have like an Epic bar or something like that, and just kind of a little snack here and there. But they're so excited to swim that they won't get out. And they might do a half decent dinner, but then oftentimes they are so smoked by the end of the day of swimming. I mean, like 6 hours of swimming, they're in the sun and all the rest of that. They don't even really eat that much. Like, they're almost like passing out at the table. But then the next day they get up and they eat everything, which I think is that's a great, in general, kids tend to do a really good job with that. And I think that this is something that, over the course of time, because of my kind of like powerlifting background for ages, I just kind of overate because I felt like I needed to eat more. And I finally, at almost 50, have gotten to a spot where it's like, if I just kind of sit on my duff all day, I don't eat that much food. And then on the day where I'm real active, I may lift weights and do 2 hours of jiu-jitsu. I eat a lot of food that day. And then maybe even the following day, I'm like, man, I'm pretty hungry. And so I end up eating more. So that if we're not eating odd foods, I think that the appetite control mechanisms are very well in place. And I wouldn't worry about a round of antibiotics like displacing that stuff. It's a great question to ask, but I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. Anything else as a mom to cap that off?
I don't think so. I think it is cyclic. I mean, I think that's fairly normal, where one day they might eat a ton and the next day it tapers off a bit. And, she's not going to starve herself. No.
And the thing that we do, we kind of make it a speed bump method. We really kind of hold the kids' feet to the fire. It's like, you got to eat your protein, and then if you want some more of this other stuff, then we kind of open it up, and that works fine. And we have noticed, even within the 2 kids, like if Sagan in particular, who seems to kind of take after me a little bit more, at least in some ways, if she doesn't get enough protein, that kid gets cranky, real cranky, and it's just like a switch just flips. And then she'll eat, and she's good. So I think she ends up potentially getting a little bit of these kind of blood sugar changes if she's not getting enough protein. And so you'll notice a little bit of variability on that. Whereas I think Zoe is a little bit more like you, and just a little more even keel with regards to, she'll eat a lot of protein, but even if she doesn't, it doesn't seem to affect her quite the same way. But Sagan's also going through a growth spurt. So I don't know how much of that's going on. She's sleeping
15 hours.
Yeah. And she's just been sprouting. So that's a whole other crazy thing to this. And it's been funny all the way along. Like, now that the girls are basically 7 and 5, the changes aren't quite as dramatic. Like, they're in that, maybe up to about 3 years old, maybe 4 years old. It feels like every time you kind of get dialed in on one sequence, then they change and you've got to rejigger things, but they still change over time. And for sure right now, Sagan is growing a lot, sleeping a lot. And we noticed that if she doesn't eat well, she will get some cranky McCrankerkins going on. Yeah.
I think that's a wrap for this week.
Yep. Thank you guys for the awesome questions. Enjoy doing this as always. Most of my activity, at least for a while, is still over at Instagram at @DasRobWolf. This episode brought to you by
drink Element Recharge, and hope you guys are all having a great and safe summer.
We'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.